strength, and might. For some, this is the ultimate sign of superiority. The ability and raw power to dominate your foes in competition to the extent that you're the unquestioned best in class. If you look carefully, you can see this through many avenues in life, but never is it more apparent than in sport and competition. Konami, like many competitive leagues, always desires some level of parity, but sometimes in Yu-Gi-Oh! An archetype or deck is simply too overwhelmingly strong for anything else to stop it. It utterly crushes its competitors, puts a stranglehold on the metagame, and quickly becomes public enemy number one. This is what it means to be the world's strongest. In this new series I've titled The History of Tier 0 in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'll be relatively subjective term. I believe I've selected the best and right decks. Dominance, consistency, overall power ceiling, and Konami's reaction have all been taken into consideration. Let's travel back to the very end of 2007 and essentially the final full year of the Gladiators Assault 4 booster set, which launched on November 14th in North America. Despite 2007 being a wildly popular and beloved year with competitive players, the core booster sets had a noticeable slump in the second half of the year. This was on full display when the entire TCG Gladiators Assault set was revealed. I'm not exaggerating when I say most players initially ranked this set somewhere between D and F tier, premiering Cloudians, Evil Heroes, and packed with, this can't be right, Alien support? Good lord, TCG exclusives couldn't bail it out. Many agreed that Soul Taker and Necroface had potential, but the others weren't worth bothering with. Lastly, there was the new and somewhat misunderstood Gladiator Beast. These were a new Beast, Beast Warrior, and Wing Beast contact fusion archetype that were utterly and completely battle focused. The archetype largely revolved around their special tag out ability, in which, after battling, one Glad monster would tag out for another. The incoming Glad would then gain a bonus effect upon being tagged in. These bonuses had an incredibly wide range in terms of practicality and usefulness. Everything from the underwhelming 300 defense gain of Haplamus to the incredibly potent destruction effects of Bestiary and Myrmilio. The Gladiator Beast archetype didn't initially resonate very much with the competitive crowd. Many thought the theme's over-reliance on the battle phase to make meaningful advantage was simply more trouble than it was worth. Sure, they've got a few nice effects, but don't they all just lose out to cards like Mirror Force and Sakuretsu Armor, many wondered aloud? Glads lacked the definitive search card, their Coliseum build spell was just awful, and while the archetype did actually have a ton of spell and trap support right out of the gate with 8 different cards, Respite was pretty much the only good one. Most probably don't even remember this, but Glads actually premiered with 3 different equip spells. It made sense for a battle-focused beatdown archetype, and the equips went back to your hand if the Glads were tagged out, but they were also somewhat redundant, as they mostly just mimicked the effects that tagged-in GB monsters already had. These spells also offered nothing in terms of playmaking for an opening play. In addition, while they did make your Glads incrementally stronger, they also made them more susceptible to disruption. If you were hit by a Book of Moons or lost out the Mirror Force, you were now at risk of losing 2 cards rather than just 1. With all these factors working against the Gladiator Beast archetype, combined with no clear evidence of it being meta in the OCG, which I'll touch on later, overwhelmingly, duelists didn't even bother trying Glads on the competitive regional and Shonen Jump circuit. Looking back, I have to defend Konami here. Of course, GB were far from great after their initial release, but after counting a couple of TCG exclusives, Glads premiered with damn near 20 cards, which of course is insane. They don't call this set Gladiators Assault for nothing. Over the next 3 months of the September 2007 format, there would be 3 Shonen Jump championships and regionals all across the TCG. Gladiator Beast would top exactly 0 of them. As mentioned earlier, competitive players just wouldn't give them the time of day, and despite most knowing little to nothing about them, they were largely considered to be around tier 3-ish at best. As Phantom Darkness premiered and the TCG entered the March 2008 format, it truly appeared that Glads were destined to be another forgotten GX mediocre archetype. After all, it hadn't come close to even sniffing a premier event top. And now to make matters worse, the TCG was in a full-blown Tier 0 format under the new Darkon Dragon Return deck. more powerful, certainly much faster, and downright explosive on the level that none of the other contenders could consistently match, Dad Return easily won Shonen Jump's Costa Mesa, Columbus, and completing the three-peat seemed inevitable. But the interesting thing about the GX era was, having a team of great, brilliant, and innovative minds wasn't just a gigantic advantage. It was basically a cheat code in terms of achieving competitive success on the highest levels. Back in those days, it was very commonplace to have the most elite players in North America form up to create super teams. Being part of one of these juggernaut super teams like Outphase, Hunger Force, Super Friends, or Team Nexus granted you access to the best test partners, rarest and hard to find cards, and of course the best kept secret strategies that teams would work on for weeks, then unveil at high-end events like Shonen Jump Championships. This is exactly how the legendary Team Comic Odyssey won a Shonen Jump Championship with their brilliant and never seen before CO Burn that took the world by surprise. At YCS Minneapolis held on the first weekend of April, the revered Team Overdose attempted to do the same exact thing. You may not know the name, but Team Overdose was without a doubt one of the 2 or 3 most successful teams during the entire GX era, hoisting names like 3-time Shonen Jump champion Iman Ganin, 2-time winner Shane Scurry, who actually won the previous year's Shonen Jump Minneapolis, and names like Paul Leviton and Anthony Alvarado, both of which were already Shonen champions, and would be competing at the event with gladiator beasts of all possible choices. Head feature writer and highly accomplished player Matt Petal was completely stunned by the deck choice, so much so he openly admitted to it being the sole reason he gave Alvarado a feature match in round 2. Overdose wasn't just known for its elite players, but also for having near endless resources. These guys were like rare hunters and could obtain any cards. Why choose a tier 3 deck for a Shonen Jump? What members of Overdose learned far sooner than the rest of the TCG is that if given a little bit of time, the Gladiator Beast deck was quite solid, and its grind game was surprisingly strong. Also, to put it bluntly, no one even knew what the hell any of these monsters did, let alone what their core strategy was. With so little familiarity, most players didn't know how to properly disrupt or attempt to combat the Gladiator Beast deck itself. It was far different than dueling against the highly explosive Dad Return or one of the dark-based FTK decks. Glads were never looking to one-shot you or pull 8,000 damage out of a single card like the mentioned Fusion. This was on display in Alvarado's round 2 feature as he methodically and surgically dissected a duelist named Joe Mooney, en route to a 2-0 victory. In Alvarado's opening turn, he started with a simple Trap Dust Shoot and Solemn Judgment set. Nothing too intimidating. However, that Solemn Judgment allowed him to push through Mooney's copy as he used Test Tiger for a key Murmillo tag to capture control in victory. The 2 Overdose members grinded through hordes of Dad-inspired decks, and both would actually make it to the Day 2 Top 16 cut. Alvarado would fall in his Top 16 match against Mario Matthew, but nothing would stop Paul Leviton. In the semifinals, he faced newcomer Anthony Duke. Paul put on an absolute clinic as going second, he opened the duel by reborning Duke's Disc Commander, drawing 2 cards, then heavy storming him. A turn later, he would use Test Tiger to tag in the Secator and attack a Goat token. This led to the game-sealing Heraclinos plus Shadow Imprisoning Mirror Lock. When Duke tried using his own Storm, Leviton discarded Torrential Tribute to negate it, as Duke said aloud, "Oh yeah," and began to pick up his cards. We were now in the semifinals of a Shonen Jump Championship, and Leviton's opponent seemingly had no idea about Heraclinos' only effect. This just goes to show that people barely even knew what the Gladiator Beast cards did. Leviton would go on to win that match 2-0, then avenge his teammate Alvarado as he took down Mario Matthew, led by a devastating Crush Card Virus play that swung the finals. In a stunning turn of events, Gladiator Beast had now won a Shonen Jump Championship, which by the way is still largely to this day considered to be one of the most shocking finishes in the circuit's history. Just look at what Matt Petal wrote as his closing headline. Quote, "Someone has finally done it. Dark Arm Return has been beaten, and by none other than Team Overdose player Paul Leviton. Paul took his Gladiator Beast deck to the tournament yesterday, just hoping not to get embarrassed, and after a first round loss, he simply refused to lose again. unquote. The Yu-Gi-Oh world was in absolute shock as a perceived tier 3 deck had now done the impossible and taken down a tier 0 one. While many like myself were completely confused by how this was even possible, it's clear to see that Leviton and Alvarado, who played the same exact deck card for card, built this deck with one main purpose: destroy Dark Armed Dragon. A playset of Shadow Mirrors in the main were like kryptonite versus dad decks. Dark Armed Dragon, Malicious, DMOC, Disc Commander. If it wasn't named Stratos, Shadow Mirror would basically turn it off like a light switch. Solemn Judgments were risky but also needed for versatility. This could answer every single action they threw at you, and even be used offensively to protect your pushes. Lastly, there was the all-world powerful Crush Card Virus. It was often said in those days that Crush Card Virus would destroy any deck not specifically designed to survive it, and that return was not. Crush Card Virus may have been a $2,000 card in those days, but as mentioned earlier, Overdose had deep pockets, and every single member of the team owned a copy of the card. In fact, it wasn't the only Shonen Jump prize card in the deck, as they also mained another $2,000 card in Gold Sarcophagus. The Overdose boys also fully committed to trying to slow the game down ASAP. They knew if they didn't get blown out in the first couple of turns, they would definitely win the grind game. Swords of Revealing Light and even Ojama Trio were both mained to achieve that. Trio could not only clog up your opponent's zones to disrupt Dimension Fusion or return plays, but it also put monsters in defense mode for you to attack into, leading to free tags for your Glads. Many question the inclusion of Crush Card in a deck with only 2 targets, but it was simply too explosive not to use if you had the card, and technically Gold Sarcophagus could search it from the deck. One thing many players overlooked, but I believe the Overdose team learned in testing, was the difference that Test Tiger made. This card was a TCG exclusive and literally changed everything about the deck. For starters, it made removal effects like Bestiari and Murmillo far stronger as you could use them prior to the battle phase. Secondly, it made Gladiator Beast Secator actually work as a card. With Test Tiger, you could tag into Secator, crash into a defense position monster, or attack your opponent directly, boom, instant Heraklinos. Considering Secator was essentially the only practical way to summon the card, it goes without saying, but this was incredibly important. The OCG didn't have access to any of these plays, which was probably a large part of why it initially did so poorly there. It's kind of shameful to say, but most TCG players were too close-minded and lazy to test Gladiator Beast, thus they didn't learn any of this until Overdose had already claimed the championship. As high-flying as the Glad deck was coming off of its shocking and impressive SJC win, it ironically didn't carry over to the next event, like at all. Despite the May 9th emergency ban list, which axed Dimension Fusion and limited return from the different dimension, that decks went right back to domination as they claimed the event even in a significantly weaker state. To make things even more puzzling, not a single Gladiator Beast deck made the top 16 cut. I know, doesn't make much sense, right? For many in the community, this just didn't add up. Some wondered whether Paul Leviton's win in Minnesota was just a fluke. That theory sounded good at first, but would be quickly dismissed just 2 weeks later. On May 13th, the Light of Destruction core booster set was released. Despite being incredibly light-focused with Battery Man and the all-new, long-awaited Light Lord theme, the most powerful monster initially was arguably a dark one. I'll repeat what I said the first time I made this video. In a world of Judgment Dragons and Dark Arms, Gladiator Beast Skyzaris was actually the baddest dude on the block. This monster was meta-defining and fully unlocked the archetype. Glads went from being a super reactive control deck to the big bad bully that made everyone else react to it. Skyzaris was insane in terms of power, allowing you to destroy 2 cards the second it hit the field, swing with a massive monarch-sized body, and unlike Heraklinos, this powerhouse could tag out, which actually meant more potential destruction and advantage with Murmillo and Bestiari. It was also ruled that players could conduct contact fusions with face-down monsters, for some reason. This organically gave Skyzaris plays resistance to cards like Bottomless Trap Hole and Book of Moon. Grisara specifically required Bestiary to summon, but that didn't matter much. Not only did Glads now have a Rhoda in Gladiator Proving Ground, but more importantly, we had the meta-breaking Prisma plus Test Tiger play. This play involved using E-Hero Prisma to copy Bestiary's name by sending him to the grave. You would then summon Test Tiger and tag Prisma into the deck as if he was a regular Glad. You tag in Darius to reborn the Bestiary, and there was your easy button for Gyzarus. This play might sound like it was susceptible to all forms of removal like Torrential Tribute and other cards, and it definitely was. Except Cold Wave was completely unlimited at that time, and that shut down everything not named Skill Drain. Heavy Storm, Giant Trunade, MST, Gladiator Beasts were now on the offensive, and they played all those cards in droves. Gyzarus was now the strongest monster of the format, and if you got hit with him, your chances of winning were minuscule, to put it lightly. The best counter to this crippling play was actually DD Crow. DD Crow was searchable by Sangan, unaffected by Spell and Trap suppression, and doubled as a Crush Card Virus target, assuming you could actually afford Crush Card Virus. If you crowed the Bestiary that Darius was attempting to reborn, it could deal a devastating blow to the Gladiator Beast player. At Shonen Jump St. Louis, Glads laid down the law, and there was clearly a new sheriff in town. It was basically the old guard of Dad decks versus the new guard of GB. If you're curious about the outcome, just know the entire top 4 of the tournament was Gladiator Beast. This put to bed what the better deck was, and to be honest, a lot of Dad players dropped the deck immediately following the events of St. Louis in favor of Glads. The sudden influx of players rushing to pick up cards sent shockwaves through the secondary market as E-Hero Prisma jumped to $40 a copy and Heraklinos hit $300 per. Keep in mind it had only been printed one time as a secret rare in Gladiator's Assault, and of course in those days there wasn't a holo in every single pack of cards. Moving forward, the meta became you either ran Gladiator Beast or you pretty much tried to build your deck specifically to counter them. In fact, Glads had become so dominant leading into the US and Canadian Nationals, most Glad Beast players thought it was smarter to ignore literally every other possible matchup and just main for the mirror rather than the other way around. If you're playing Glads, you should inherently smash every other matchup was pretty much the mentality. Honestly, it was pretty correct. Other decks like Counter Fairies, Dad variants, and Skill Drain heroes would top large-scale events like Shonen Jumps, but GB would always come out on top. St. Louis, Philadelphia, Honolulu, Toronto, Indianapolis, and each would be won by Gladiators. Not to mention the US and Canadian National Championships, as well as the 2008 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship. Glads were just winning everything. Many expected that the September 2008 Forbidden Unlimited list was going to absolutely eviscerate the deck. But to everyone's total surprise, the Tier 0 deck received not a single hit. While players like myself proclaimed the end of days and another 6 months of Glads, there was an even worse terror on the horizon. The new Synchro mechanic had arrived, and with it, the successor to Dad returned, Teledad. At Shonen Jump Baltimore held on September 6th, we would have a true heavyweight showdown, with format supremacy hanging in the balance. It was Teledad versus Gladiator Beast, and most competitive duelists were split. The tried and true champion who does nothing but win, or the new and improved Dark Arm Dragon deck with its arsenal of flashy white synchro monsters. Even going into day 2, it was a complete pick'em with 8 Teledad versus 6 Gladiator Beasts. The climax of the event was truly epic, as those 2 decks ended up in the finals. When the dust all settled, the champion was still victorious on this day, as Glads were able to hold on and capture their 6th straight Shonen Championship. While the battle on that day was won, the war in the grand scheme of the format was ultimately lost. The champ had held on for one last time, but as many pointed out, this was simply Teledad's first showing, and the deck would only get better from here. Right they were. At next month's Shonen Jump Tulsa, Teledad placed a commanding 11 players in the top 16 cut to Glad's 1. This was the end of the line, and while the ban list had failed to take down the champion, a brand new mechanic and Yu-Gi-Oh's ever-reliable power creep had. Glads had been surpassed by the Teledad deck. And with that, we are at the conclusion to one of my absolute favorite Yu-Gi-Oh stories. So ironic that Glads rose from absolutely nothing to somehow take down a Tier 0 deck. then become a tier 0 deck themselves that was so dominant it could only be defeated ultimately by, you guessed it, another tier 0 deck. It's a wild story and I really enjoy telling it. If you enjoyed this video, or more importantly, you learned something, hit the thumbs up, and of course, come back and subscribe for more videos like this in the future, or maybe consider checking out some of the other stories on screen that I think you'll enjoy as well. Thanks for watching.